Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. Today we're going to be talking about writing middle grade. If you haven't already seen it, we do have a video on defining children's categories, so I would definitely recommend watching that video before you watch this one. In that video, I broke down the different children's categories, so if you're not sure if your book is, say, children's or middle grade or YA, I recommend watching that. It also covers things like what kind of content is generally allowed in the different subsets of children's fiction. In today's video though, we're just going to be focusing on middle grade and some tips for writing in this category. If you're a little further down the line, we've also got an entire video on publishing children's fiction, so I'll also leave that in the description. Middle grade fiction is fiction written for readers between the ages of 8 to 12 and usually follows characters between the ages of 10 to 13. As a general rule, kids usually like to read about characters who are 2 years older than they are, which is why the ages are a little higher for character versus reader. Middle grade books usually fall somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 words, a little bit shorter than YA and other categories. One question people often have when it comes to middle grade is about content. This can be a really confusing area of writing children's fiction, especially because the line can become kind of blurry with lower YA and upper middle grade. In general though, middle grade is written for relatively young kids, which means there shouldn't be any profanity or graphic violence. There can be some violence in middle grade. For example, there might be a battle scene in a fantasy book, but we're not really going to see any of the gritty details of that. You can still write about darker subject matter in middle grade, but in a way that's age appropriate. Topics such as family troubles, grief, and illness are actually relatively common in middle grade. They just have to be handled in a way that's appropriate for the age group. Remember, kids who are reading middle grade fiction are at the age where they're starting to have a pretty strong detector for when adults are lying to them. So they can really tell if you're dumbing down a subject or really sugarcoating it for the sake of the plot. You don't have to lie or misrepresent a topic, but you should present it considering that it might be one of the first times this child has encountered this topic both in life and in fiction. That's why it's really important when you're looking for editors to hire an editor who does specialize in middle grade fiction, because they can help you determine on a detail to detail level basis whether or not your book is age appropriate. When it comes to point of view, middle grade fiction is usually written either first person present tense, similar to YA, or third person past tense. Third person is actually a lot more common in middle grade than it is in YA, where it's a bit of a rarity. But the YA standard of first person present tense has kind of leached into middle grade, so that's an appropriate point of view to use as well. Although you will also see some first person past tense, especially if you're reading kind of older middle grade that was published like 15, 20 years ago. When you're writing middle grade fiction, it's really helpful to not only think back to who you were when you were 11, 12, but also have sympathy for that person. It's very common when we think back to our middle school age selves to kind of just feel embarrassed by that person. When I think back to who I was when I was 12, I think about this like really unflattering hairstyle that I wore every single day, and I think about how awkward I was, and I replay like a variety of embarrassing grade 6 memories. It becomes really easy to laugh at our younger selves as we get older. But when you're writing middle grade, it's really important to actually have sympathy for who you were at that age. Think about how confused and awkward you were, not as something to laugh at, because you don't want your readers to feel like you're mocking the place they are in life, but a stage of life that helps you grow. If you're feeling a little out of touch with your younger self, there's one almost constant relatable experience for most young people, if not all young people. It's feeling weird or different, but thinking you're the only one who feels that way. Most kids feel weird or different from their peers and are absolutely terrified of other people noticing this about them. So try to think about if that's true for you and if it might be true to your character. Even though it's very rare in fiction that we can apply a single experience to any character, this is a bit of an exception because in middle grade, this is a fairly constant aspect of most preteen psychology. Of course, it's not every single case, but it is very common. So if you don't really know where to start in terms of thinking like a 12-year-old again, that might be a good place to begin. Family relationships are also often very important in middle grade. In young adult, it's very common to see the absent parent trope, where the characters might have parents in their lives, but we just never see them, they're never around, to the point that it's become a little bit laughable. It's a trope that people notice quite often. Middle grade is actually quite different. Kids who are reading YA, who are in their teenage years, are usually starting to really crave independence, and they don't want to read stories about a character whose mom is heavily involved. At age 10, you're not really seeking total emancipation from your parents, so that's why you usually see parents and also siblings as an important role in a middle grade story, especially because for most readers, those are probably going to be very important people in their own lives. Friendships, or a group of friends, kind of like a fun squad of characters, are also a common dynamic that you see in middle grade, whereas in YA, the core relationship of a story often tends to focus around a romance. If it's also been a long time since you were in middle school, or even a short amount of time, make sure you don't use outdated slang terms. It can be quite common as an instinct to go back to the slang terms that were common or popular when you were in middle school. But slang changes relatively quickly, unless your book is intentionally set in the past. Make sure that you're not using outdated slang. However, it can also be really awkward to try to do a deep dive into what slang the kids and the youths are using these days and hit that point way too hard. So be really careful when trying to incorporate slang into your work. It can date the book really quickly, even if it is currently accurate. You also want to be careful not to parent your characters. It can also be a natural impulse, especially for writers who are parents themselves. Trying to parent the characters from the page, make sure that they're really being taught good morals and good lessons, can become kind of patronizing for young readers. When a kid is reading a middle grade book, they don't want to feel like their parents are hiding behind the page, secretly trying to parent them through the character. You do want the character to learn something by the end of the story and to have grown, but if the character is constantly being reprimanded or parented for every little decision that they make, or if the main character themselves is being a little too preachy to the reader, this can really annoy a young reader since they have a pretty good instinct for this kind of thing. Similarly, you want to make sure you don't talk down to the reader. Don't underestimate a kid's intelligence. In middle grade fiction, characters don't tend to be as introspective as in YA. Young adult fiction is often very heavy on internal monologue. A lot of the story will be spent with the character thinking and reflecting and narrating, whereas middle grade is more focused outward, on observing what's going on around them. However, it doesn't mean that you want to simplify things too much. Although middle grade fiction should be fast-paced with a relatively clean, streamlined plot, if you try to dumb down the language or even the plot and explain it too much to the reader, they're going to feel like they're not being trusted. Language should be clean, concise, poetic, and smooth. You don't want anything too tangled or complicated, but that doesn't mean that you should dumb it down. Never underestimate a young reader's intelligence. They can pick up a lot more than you might expect. As always, if you're not sure where to start, the best thing to do would be to read a lot of middle grade. I hadn't read middle grade in years, but I picked up a middle grade book last year for a children's writing class that I was taking, and I was actually really surprised at how, emotionally complicated and interesting the plot was. I guess it had been so long since I'd read middle grade that I kind of forgot how much a young reader can take away from a story and how complicated and intriguing of a story they might enjoy reading. What are your favorite middle grade books? So thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing tips every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time.